So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Breaking Bias Summit. I am so excited to welcome our guest today, Lama Owens, who is a Black Buddhist Southern Queen, an international influencer with a Master of Divinity in Buddhist Studies from Harvard Divinity School. He's also the author of The New Saints, From Brokenhearted to Spiritual Warriors, and Love and Rage, the Path of Liberation Through Anger. And he's also the co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. One of my favorites as I entered into this path, over 10 years ago. His teachings really center on freedom, self-expression, and radical self-care. A leading voice in a new generation of Buddhist teachers with over 11 years of experience, Lama Rod activates the intersections of his identity to create a platform that's very natural, engaging, and inclusive. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I mean, when we were thinking about doing this event, you were probably one of the first few names that came up. We're like, we'd love to bring Lama Rod, given what you've done within the Western Buddhist context. And yeah, I think your beingness is very much breaking biases, these conceptions of the multiplicity of identities that you hold and carry, and also invite others to do for themselves. So as we begin today, I'd love for you to kind of take a deep breath with me and just, land here with me first. And then as we do that, just kind of reflecting on how you feel about bias in our society today.
Yeah.
Just sharing any personal experiences or any somatic experiences that may be arising for you at this moment.
The experience that comes into focus is this felt experience of rigidity, of borders, of restriction,
Yeah.
surveillance, this idea of like being, or not an idea, like this feeling of just being restricted, being boxed.
Yeah.
And the frustration, right?
Yeah.
Just like really deeply felt frustration and confusion about this experience of being boxed
Yeah.
and surveilled and guarded.
Yeah.
And then the fear, which I feel in my stomach, the fear of the consequences of pushing against
Yes.
boundaries, those borders, right? And
Yeah.
then like the confusion around how to find fluidity within this rigidity.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. And as you were sharing, like the somatic experience that was coming up for me was the inability to exhale.
Yeah.
So just like taking in so much, but just like not being able to relax, right? To let go. And yeah, that's, really well said. And thank you for sharing that. And if we kind of counterpose that experience with how would you feel in a world without bias, a world where belonging replaces bias? What visions or images or somatic experiences come up for you there?
It's so interesting, because with that question where I go to is also a kind of anxiety, right? Because I don't, I struggle to conceptualize what that would feel.
Yeah.
To be fluid and free and not restrained. I think that's like the part of the conditioning of bias is that we're trained not to dream
Yeah.
beyond the conditions of the present rigidity, right? But even to push beyond that anxiety, right?
Yeah.
to challenge myself to dream, it would be, of course, the first thing is fluidity, movement,
Mm.
to this capacity to become
Yeah.
what I most need to be.
Yeah.
Right? Um, part of my personality type, I think, is to feel initially overwhelmed by abundance,
Yeah.
which I think maybe is an experience many people share, particularly many of us who grow up with restrictions, maybe material restrictions, social restrictions, the kind of what bias creates. Like it's like we learn how to survive in very little, but when we're given a lot, then there's another kind of obstacle, which is anxiety,
Mm.
push through and just say, oh, if I were completely free, this is who I would be,
Yeah.
you
It
know?
it almost feels like this sense of internalized bias, right? The sense of unworthiness,
Mhm.
because one has been told for so long that they're unworthy of all of these things. And suddenly the life experience is the opposite of what it's been through our conditioning.
Yeah,
And then, for me, I mean, it rings so true, right? As a queer person, as a brown person, as an immigrant,
yeah,
where the opportunities I've been afforded have been beyond my conception. Like my grandmother, you know, she was basically married off when she was in the fourth grade,
yeah,
so all my life I'd grown up hearing that she was illiterate and good for nothing. Of course she was, and she's an incredibly wise person. But in the society that we live in, there's such a rigid aspect of who belongs, who's worthy, and who isn't. And oftentimes in our society, particularly in the West, it's folks with queer identities who are Black and brown, who are immigrant or undocumented, as known as, and so many other intersectionalities.
yeah.
So, what I love about what you've been working on, this new book, right, which is
Mhm.
out, The New Saints,
Yeah,
it kind of affords us an opportunity to dream, actually.
yeah,
Even though the boxing is there, no shade, the boxing is there.
yeah,
It's true, but it
yeah,
does. So I'd love for you to kind of share a little bit more about what inspired you to
yeah,
write that book and how
yeah,
that's connected to breaking bias.
yeah. Well, I know it's about the dream. This is the very same conversation. I challenge myself to dream
Mhm.
beyond my present conditions, right? Because I look at the world and I say, "Oh, we need to start dreaming into
Yeah,
being something different than what we're experiencing, and we have to journey through the anxiety and the fear of what
yeah,
that looks like and what it feels like, right?" So, when I was thinking about this idea of the new saints, I said that we have to really begin to reawaken into a new kind of sainthood, right? A sainthood that's really about bringing about a more liberated future.
yeah,
But to get to a liberated future, we have to change. We have
yeah,
to change individually, we have to change collectively, right? And so much of that change is, for me, at least in terms of writing this book, was actually having to just cut through a lot of how internalized bias shows up for me, which is self-criticism, self-policing, self-censorship.
wow,
Mm, and I had to really root myself in a real vision
mhm,
of my potential and the potential that I see so
yeah,
in this moment. Like, this is what we can become if we can actually journey through the bias to the other side
yeah,
into this spaciousness, this dream, this liberation beyond
yeah.
the rigidity that we're experiencing right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to kind of really highlight this because, for so many of our listeners and viewers, you're Lama Rod, you're, in their minds at least, this conception that, oh, like you've worked on these issues and now you're on the other side. But
Right.
for you to even vulnerably share that, oh no, self-criticism is still here,
Mhm,
internalized bias is still here,
mhm.
it's still talking, it's still yapping away,
Yeah,
and I'm a work in progress.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
how, what are some kind of ways that your Dharma practice,
yeah,
or other practices, have supported you in kind of managing this
yeah,
false voice that's oftentimes within bodies of subordinated, marginalized humans?
yeah. Well, so much of my healing work started before Dharma, and when I talk about like how did I learn to like really practice fearlessness? Well, I learned it from people around me who were practicing fearlessness,
Mm,
who knew how to cut through the fear,
yeah.
the anxiety to be completely themselves. I'm talking
Mm,
about my queer friends,
mm,
my trans friends, my transgender friends, starting in my teens and
yeah.
moving into my college years. Like I found myself in community with people who were making choices to be themselves
Mm,
and who were very clear and very aware of the consequences of those choices, and I was deeply inspired by that, and I took that, and I remember the work of my ancestors, particularly my
yes.
ancestors who were enslaved, right, and who have survived systemic racism and anti-blackness. I remember their courage and their activism. I remember our queer ancestors, right, whom we wouldn't be here,
Yeah.
right, without their activism, their love for themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So even before I got to like meditation practice, like I was already kind of super rooted in this, But what meditation and Dharma practice helped me to do was to go even further, either even deeper
Yeah.
into the roots, right, of all of this kind of self-criticism, all this fear. What I would call in my work, how the Dharma really has helped me to go into the underworld,
Yeah.
into the subconscious, into these places where a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of trauma
Yeah.
sits, right? And Dharma really is my ongoing daily exploration and healing and tending to of that material in the underworld, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, even in this position as a teacher and so forth, people really have to understand that like this is still my daily work,
Yeah.
of using the tools, the power of Dharma to bring awareness to what feels impossible to be aware of and to do the work of healing, which is releasing, which is cleansing, which is redirecting energy
Mhm.
and dreaming. Each moment of healing is an invitation re to redream, I would say,
Yeah. Yeah.
because the its circumstances have changed. Now I have new resources to
Yeah.
use in dreaming, and in that dreaming, I become
Yeah.
more myself, which is my ultimate dream, is to become my most authentic self.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. Like, so much of what you've shared, I'm really thinking about dreaming fearlessly for a liberated future,
Yeah,
right? And when you said the word fearless, what came up for me. So of course, I practice in the Buddhist tradition, but also in the Hindu, Vedic, and the Christian tradition, like
yeah,
interspiritual across these three traditions.
yeah,
And um, in the Bhagavad Gita, the first divine quality that's mentioned, one is to have, is fearlessness,
mhm,
abhaya.
yeah,
And it's something that's really important for us to remember, that many of our ancestors really walked their lives, not just for their lives, for the duration of generations of lives, right?
right,
Um, I think it was Isabel Wilkerson talks about, you know, 12 generations of Africans were enslaved.
yeah,
That's just in the United States. If you go to other places, whether it's Brazil or other parts of
mhm,
the Americas, might be longer.
yeah,
And what kept them going was this idea of fearlessness.
yep, yeah, yeah. the fearlessness and the hope as
Yeah.
well. You know, there's there's no freedom without hope,
Hmm.
right?
What does hope mean to you? Like, how would you even
Hope,
describe it, whether it's a vision or a embodied experience or?
yeah. I mean, hope really for me is the realization that everything's always changing.
Mm.
You know, there's always a new moment, right?
Mm.
Nothing is necessarily set in stone, right?
Yeah.
Because of this constant shifting, then there is a case.
Yeah.
What I need to happen is possible. And it's
Wow.
even more possible if I figure out what the work is in the moment to
Wow.
bring about the future that I'm hoping for, right? Because hope without work and labor
Yeah.
is still beautiful, but will it really come about? Will it come to fruition if there's no labor?
Yeah.
This is what my ancestors have taught me, never to give up, you know,
Mhm.
as we say, right, as I think Reverend Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson, I think, always said, I can remember growing up, is that keep hope alive, keep hope alive.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
Hogan, I can, keep hope alive. And like, it sounds like a cliche, but it's actually imperative, right? Like, we have to stay rooted in change, right? As Octavia Butler talked about in the parable of the swords and the parable of the talents, like
Yeah.
this,
I love that.
yeah, this teaching that God is change,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
which is so uncomfortable on one hand, but also
Yeah.
deeply liberating on the other. Like, God is change. If you're trying to pinpoint God, it's impossible.
Don't box God.
You don't feel boxed out in the same way we feel boxed, right?
Yeah.
It's like God is in the movement. The divine,
Yeah.
the sacred is movement. It's
Yeah.
it's it's expansion. Like,
Mm.
you can't pinpoint that kind of fluidity. The only way to worship that kind of that kind of sacredness is to become,
Yeah.
right? Is to surrender to that stream that's always moving back into the ultimate, right?
It's so
You know,
profound. And as I like listened to you, I was tearing up because the way you described hope, as change, as impermanence, which is one of the three fundamental truths of life, with suffering and, interdependence. Um, but I was also reminded of how I started this journey, of anti-racism and kind of working on issues of racial equity now for almost 15 years. Um, I was in law school and I was a student of Derek Bell's and kind of someone who coined critical race theory and had transitioned right after I graduated from law school. And one of the tenets of his theory, conversions, is that racism is permanent.
yeah.
And as someone who believed in hope,
Mhm.
that just like struck me. It was like, well, nothing is permanent.
Mhm.
Things are constantly changing and evolving. And his answer was like, well, I'm making a provocative statement based on 2 centuries of evidence,
Mhm.
but prove me otherwise.
Mhm. Mhm.
Can we make this system of
Mhm.
entrenched hierarchies in our society, in our world,
Mhm.
impermanent?
Yeah.
And that's, for me, has been like, oh wow, that's like a wake up to a dream.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is really, like, it's evocative as well, you
Yeah.
know? And I'm sure the dinosaurs thought they were permanent as well before
Right.
the meteor landed. Um, but yeah, that pervasiveness, and I think that's what we encounter in the work, right? Is that hopelessness. Like,
Yeah.
we see the work, we see the moment, and we see the work that takes to change the moment, and we say, well, this is impossible.
Hmm.
And what I say, is, I deeply believe I will never see an end to racism in my lifetime,
Yeah.
which is fine. Like, it has to be fine,
Right.
because that's really how it is. Like, I have to be okay with that. But after, I got to that point, I said, but this still isn't going to stop me
Yeah.
from becoming my most authentic self. And I think that's the line for a lot of folks that we have to get to. It's just
Yeah.
like, yes, we're trying to disrupt these systems that perpetuate these kinds of harms, right, in terms of bias and discrimination and so forth. And at the same time, I can no longer wait for the system to collapse before I do the work of healing,
Yes. Yes.
and liberation, from the conditioning of these systems.
No,
Right?
it just, that so resonates. Racism may not end out there, but I have the choice and I have to cultivate the will to end it in here. And that's basically what our lifetime's work can be for those of us who want to be liberated from the shackles of these lies,
Yeah.
right, that keep us separated from ourselves and one another, and just cause so much harm, unnecessary harm.
Yeah.
Instead
Yeah.
of us celebrating or partying and dancing and loving and all the things we may be able to do as humans.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, we have to learn to decenter,
Yeah.
the roots of our discontent, of our deep, deep struggle.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I can go around and talk about all these systems of dominance, from white supremacy to patriarchy to queerphobia and so forth. All that, I can talk about that all day long, right? But that doesn't help me in my healing work. Like,
Exactly.
I understand the
Yeah.
conditioning of these systems, great, but let's redirect attention
Mm.
to releasing the
Yeah.
impact of these systems. And one of the other things that I do, of course, besides hope, is the joy and the gratitude.
Mm.
Right? I am grateful. Like, every day, it's not that I do a formal gratitude practice every day, but it's more so the case that gratitude just naturally arises for me at
Yeah.
some point in the day. Like, gratitude just reminds me and says,
Mm.
listen, yeah, you're in the struggle, you're pushing and pushing, and there's all this stuff that needs to be done, right? And at the same time, look at where you've come from, look at what you've been able to do, look at the impact you've been able to have,
Yeah.
and look at like what you've been able to call in to do the
Mm.
work. And for me, that's incredibly important. It's the resources that are making themselves available,
Yeah.
for us to do the work of healing from really, internalized bias for sure, but to help others
Yeah.
healing as well, right? You know?
One of the things that I wanted to ask you is, like you, I work often with a lot of young people, and I'm no longer young, which is a reality check. Because when I started the work, I thought I was young. Now I'm very much squarely middle aged,
Mhm.
which is also part of change, right?
Yes.
Um, and it's humbling to be at this stage of my life.
Mhm.
And what I notice in a lot of young people is difficulty to
Mhm.
accept things as they are,
Yeah.
right? They
Yeah.
shouldn't be this way. We shouldn't have this hetero patriarchal racist system that's, you know, yeah. Do you have any words of,
Mhm.
advice, thoughts, wisdom around that?
Yeah. And first, what came to me is just the importance of eldership as well. Like, we recognize that we're no longer young. I am constantly using the phrase young people now.
Me
you
too.
know, what are young people doing? What are young people thinking? Young people of the future. I'm like, wait, shit, I'm no longer in that group, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay because
Mhm.
I did the work to grow from being a young person. And now there's a reward of eldership approaching, which is something that, like, I am extremely excited about,
Yeah.
is to grow old,
Yeah.
to age, to be able to share what I've struggled with,
Yeah.
and return this wisdom as elders do. The function of elders in society is to return
Yeah.
knowledge, right, and information back to keep this system, this chain of transference going, right? And to hold traditions and rituals that give structure, right, to
Yeah.
the culture. And I'm just like excited about entering into that, right? And one of the things that I offer back to young people when I'm working with them is that at some point you have to realize that in order to do the real work of change, you have to actually tell the truth about the moment,
Yes.
which is, I think, one of the principal practices of mindfulness, is also one of the principal practices, of my, kind of new field of work and study, which is spiritual abolition, which is like, if you're going to get free, you have to find your way back to this moment. And to
Yes.
get to this moment, you have to actually accept, not condone, not agree with, not celebrate, not be happy about, but you have to accept and tell the truth about what's happening. This is how we're living. This is what's going on, right?
Yeah.
This is how I feel, right? But the
Yeah.
key thing is how I feel, because I think not just young people, but many of us are really terrified of having to move through the heartbreak.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
heartbreak is really keeping us from the basic truth of things. The
Yeah.
heartbreak is keeping us kind of floating in this kind of narrative
Hmm.
created to kind of like disrupt the intensity
Yeah.
of suffering. So this is how we're coping with the truth.
Yeah.
Get to the truth of things, we have to actually, and in my mind, it's about kind of like descending into this layer of heartbreak, which is
Yeah.
disrupting this really comfortable narrative,
Exactly.
and all the ways in which I've become really dependent on this narrative, and it like shakes me awake, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that work is grief work,
I
you know,
agree.
like grieving, telling the truth, and learning how to be in a relationship with the things that feel unbearable, that feel overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Bringing so many of these contemplative practices, into bear in terms of
Mm.
holding, being with, experiencing, releasing,
Yeah.
offering spaciousness to these really strong, difficult waves, of energy. And then over time, we're slowly making contact with the truth.
Yeah.
We're able to come out of the cloud layer and actually land on the ground. And when you get to the ground, you know, you have this opportunity for the first time to actually start changing. Like
Yeah.
I can't mold things and change things until I touch the earth, the
Yes.
soil, until I hold the soil, the material that needs to be changed and shaped in my hands, and start creating something different, right? And that means you get dirty,
Yeah.
right? You know,
No.
so you let go of all that and you hit the ground and you say, now I'm working. Now,
Yeah. And to be dirty is to be one with the earth,
yes,
right?
yeah.
And it's such a beautiful share that you've just made, this comment around grief work. And I often think about like these times are really calling us to become like grief tenderers,
Mhm.
to really become so deeply intimate with grief, because um, modernity as a whole has been filled with grief,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Anywhere on the planet, colonization,
Mhm,
enslavement,
mhm.
destruction of the environment,
Yeah,
extinction of so many species, and it's ongoing.
yeah,
And yet we choose to avert our eyes from the truth of how things are
yeah,
and choose to live in a fantasy
yeah, yeah.
of a
Mhm,
capitalist,
mhm.
I don't know, capitalist heaven that everything can be monetized
Yeah,
through
mm,
um, incredibly transactional relationships.
yeah,
But I feel that grief really helps us come to what you said, the truth of how things are. And
mhm,
could you share any tools or
mhm,
practices that have helped you in tending to your grief?
mhm,
Because what's really uncomfortable is being with the feelings,
mm, mhm.
feelings of grief, this hollow, for me, it feels like hollowness. It
Yeah,
feels like like literally a pain in my heart, you
Yeah.
know? And it can feel overwhelming. You know, for the mind, it can feel overwhelming. The body is like, okay, I'm just feeling it. But the mind doesn't want to feel it.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, what's incredibly important is that I understand that I am not the only one in the world grieving, right? That this is a shared experience among
Yes.
all beings,
Yeah.
right? All conscious beings, I would say, right? Like we're all going through this. This is a natural part of consciousness,
Mm.
right? Is to try to be in relationship with change, because grief is really about change. For me, it's about how am I learning to hold a relationship with something that's changing, has changed, and even further, who am I,
Yeah.
right? And the discomfort that comes up with just struggling to figure out who am I when something has changed and shifted,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not the only one going through change, so I'm part of a collective, and that really helps to cut through isolation. And it
Yeah.
also helps to cut through the ways in which we blame ourselves, the way that we see grief or really any discomfort as punishment,
Yeah.
right? Which is a part of these these logics of carcerality. If I'm not having a good time or if I'm uncomfortable, then I've done something wrong.
Yeah.
And this is a punishment. I'm being punished. I'm not a good person because I don't feel good. you
Yeah.
know so cutting through that, and for me, it is also beyond that cutting through isolation has also been about really befriending my grief, not seeing grief as like this inconvenience, but as a
Yeah.
friend that's taking care of me, that's tending to me, and a
Mm.
friend, for the, if we have dear beloved friends in our lives, we want to take care of them.
Yeah.
Right? When your best friend calls you, like you want to be attentive, right? You want to offer whatever support you can. And so, in the same way, grief is always asking for us to tend to it, to honor it, right?
Yeah.
To not just ignore, to push it away, but to be with it, to journey with it, right? And to allow grief to help us get free,
Yeah.
right? And freedom doesn't mean grief disappears. Like
Yeah.
it's always present for me, right? But
Yeah.
when I talk about freedom in terms of my relationship to grief, I'm really talking about, can I remember there's always space
Yeah.
for me to take refuge in as grief moves through my
Yeah.
experience. Like grief isn't the only show in a way that's happening. That there's incredible spaciousness that's also taking care of me as I am taking care of grief itself.
Yeah.
One, spaciousness is taking care of everything by holding, everything. So, and I think that, even just a third important thing is to grieve with others. And I do a lot of grief work with people, collectively. So many of my, particularly in person, retreats and events are really about, at some point, creating a little bit of space for us to grieve together. Grief ritual, I will say this instead: the absence of grief rituals in a society is a really bad sign.
Yeah.
The emotional health of a society,
Yeah.
right? When you can't grieve openly, publicly,
Yeah. Yeah.
collectively, then that's a tough sign,
Yeah.
for a culture. And that's what I'm committed to, is reestablishing collective ritual grieving
Yeah.
into everything that I do.
I feel like that's one of the ways we get to the dream. To be
Mhm.
fearless is to grieve, because there is so much to grieve, of course, personally and interpersonally, but collectively, ancestrally, historically, right? And all those stories, those thoughts, those emotions remain alive in our bodies and our DNA.
Mhm.
Um, intergenerationally. So thank you for that. And it is an invitation for folks to be curious around this concept of grief, right?
Yeah.
And also, I love that idea of reframing it,
Mhm.
right? It's not like a mere inconvenience at this moment, but
Mhm.
it's really a friend.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, it's almost like chiseling our, the diamond, the lotus that's within.
Yeah. I mean, that's, this principle of friendliness, right,
Mm.
is for me an expression of tending to or tenderness, the softness, the vulnerability. That vulnerability is about truth telling,
Yeah.
right? To tell the truth. Yeah, this is what I'm experiencing. This is what I'm going through. This is what we're going through
Yeah.
together, to be able to articulate that experience will create this really intimate expression of belonging.
Mm.
When people realize that they're not suffering alone, then that creates a kind of trust
Yeah.
with others because they have a sense of what this feels like as well.
Yeah.
Right?
You feel like you're part of a whole, right? You're part of a collective because we each are, we're not little islands, It's hard to be an island that's happy on its own in an ocean of misery, right?
Exactly.
Uh,
Absolutely.
oh, this is such a joy to kind of have you drop all these truth bombs to remind us of, our potentiality of what we can become. Um, so as you kind of look forward, from where you are at the moment, like what's next? Where's your journey taking you? And
Mhm.
um, yeah,
At this point, I'm really into the dream.
I love
Right?
it. I am too.
I I am saying, let's just go for it. Like,
Yeah,
what is my ultimate dream? Not yes, for myself, right? But also for the work collectively. Like,
yeah,
what do I want to see happen, right? And that's what I'm committing to. It doesn't matter if it makes sense or not,
I
right?
agree.
And so for me in the future, it's really like deepening this kind of healing liberation work that I've been really like cultivating for years, and what that means to even further be on land. Like land has become a central part of my
Yeah,
teaching and practice, because so much of my dream is about returning back to the practices of my ancestors,
yeah,
right? And that means returning back to land, returning back to relationship with the natural world, with plant consciousness, with animal spirits, returning back to really simple, direct ways of living and
yeah,
being in dialogue with the natural world. And how that looks alongside of having fun, right?
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
all like, what does it mean to have everything and not materially, like I'm saying that like I can be with the land, I can remember the practices and embody the practices of my ancestors in a really sacred kind of remembrance. And
yeah,
at the same time, I'm listening to the album drops, I'm
yeah,
Beyonce, I'm listening to like, Billie Eilish, I'm like looking at the shows, like this is what I think people need to see as well. So
yeah,
part of my dream is actually manifesting in a way where people can actually witness what integration looks like. To be spiritual, to be an activist, to be concerned about the welfare of the collective doesn't mean that I become this kind of cliche. That's kind of
yeah,
like I'm just going to be an activist and be really serious and really overwhelming and intense, right? And I'm going to completely overlook and deny like my real need for play, for fun,
yeah,
right? And to not always talk about, the decay, of the world, to be
yeah,
frivolous. in ways that seem really generative,
Yeah.
right? To be petty in ways that seem really freeing.
Yeah.
Spaces, right?
True.
Do really hard, serious work means, and this is something that a dear friend of mine taught me many years ago as a young person. To do really serious, hard work means that it has to be balanced with just as with an equally intense level of play and fun.
Yeah.
So this is about balance, and we're not
Yeah.
balanced. Like, we're
Yeah.
in extremes right now, but the
Mhm.
way to heal, the way to move forward, the way to come back into healing is to come back into balance, right? And this is this framework of healing and getting free. Like, let's come to the balance.
Yeah.
Let's come to the middle way,
Yeah.
right? And leave this kind of extremism, because the extremism isn't the truth.
Yeah.
There's just one side of the truth.
Ashe, man. Yes. It's so true. And just bringing that animist sensibility to it all, because that's who our ancestors have been for
Yeah.
millennia, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of what our body craves, that connection with the soil, with the natural world, with the 5 elements, and we're made up of it, right? So it's really beautiful that what you've described really feels like a rehumanization process.
Yeah, it really is, because I think systems like colonialism, right, has actually othered us and dehumanized us, all of us, not just the oppressed.
Yeah, the oppressors too.
Yeah, all of us, we're dehumanized, and so we have to do this journey of returning back to our humanness, which is really the work of decolonization.
Yeah, and neuro decolonization.
Exactly, like decolonization on all levels,
Yeah.
like neuro, physical, spiritual,
Yeah,
everything,
somatic, all the things.
right?
Yeah.
And that's painful.
Mm.
Like, I don't think healing is painful.
It
Right?
is. Yeah.
Collective healing is painful. Individual healing is painful.
Yeah.
I think people have to understand that to come back into balance, right? We have to go back into all this trauma that has arisen because of imbalance.
Yeah.
You have to metabolize it. That metabolizing is where the real labor is calling us right now. We have to go back into these histories, into these frameworks.
Yeah.
And we have to deconstruct and disrupt and metabolize and let go and move this energy, right? And then we will change.
Yeah, the scholar in University of Victoria, Vanessa Andreotti, really talks about this in her book, Hospicing Modernity, where she says we really have to, as you said, metabolize, digest, and really compost the shit out of our bodies and out of our systems, because that's what it is, all this trauma. And we can do hard things.
Yeah. We can, right? But we have to be willing to choose the work and choose the discomfort.
Yeah.
Of that labor, and not all of us are going to choose it.
Yeah.
Part of my dream is really coming to terms with the fact that not everyone is interested in this work, and it has to be okay, because it is. That's the reality, right?
Yeah. Delusion is a powerful force in our world.
Instead of just throwing everything I have at people who just aren't interested.
Yeah.
How can I invest that into the lives and the experiences of people who are ready?
Yeah.
Right. And that's what my dream is. Let's go and support the people, the folks who are ready.
Let's go. Let's do this. Wow. This has been such a delight, such a joy. Thank you so much for all your wisdom, the dreams, the fearlessness, the grief, and just this opportunity for us to kind of speak truth in a way that's often marginalized and overlooked, but it's deeply resonant with our bodies.
Yeah, well,
Thank
thank you. Yeah, no, thank you, for sure, thank you, and thank you for this work, thank you for everything that you've done to
you.
create this, what I, really call medicine
Yeah.
for people, and it's always it always seems like it's the burden of the most impacted, to
Yeah.
liberate everyone, and, of course, it's not right, but it's okay, as Whitney Houston's saying,
That's right. I'm
and
gonna
just
make it anyway.
you're gonna make it anyway. That's right. You're gonna make it anyway, and so there's a burden,
Yeah.
and, my prayer, my wish is that you have all the resources
Mm,
to do this work, as I hope and pray that everyone, all of us who are on
yeah.
the front lines of this work have what we need to do this.
Oh man.
You know?
Thank you so much. Really grateful for you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mm.